My name is Karim Mustafa. I'm a neuroscientist at Northwestern University. Neuroscientist basically means I do a lot of brain research and things like that. I've been working with your teacher and a lot of you guys' teachers, actually. I've been working with for the past year or so. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited for your questions.
Awesome. Do you want to tell them what a neuroscientist does?
Yes. So, like I said, I do a lot of research with the brain. So we try to figure out kind of how the brain works, how to kind of like diagnose any diseases that might affect the brain and kind of affect everyone's behavior and emotions and things like that. So that's a lot of what I do. Um, I also work again like with teachers in schools to try to kind of make the process a little easier for you guys to do science and things like that. Um, so that's in a nutshell. But when you guys have more questions, I'll be able to probably give you more specific answers.
Can you, so some of the questions they were asking is, are you working on any COVID-19 research?
Not at the moment, no. COVID-19 research is more in the space of immunology, infectious disease kind of field. So I don't do a lot of research with COVID-19 in in the sense that I'm not looking for a drug to try to treat it or a vaccine or things like that. But I am definitely looking at kind of like ways to understand it and like how to try to maybe like educate people about it and especially students and things like that. So in that capacity, maybe a little bit, but not in like very specific details.
Can you describe some of the experiments that you do and maybe some of the tools that you use to do the experiments?
Definitely. So some of you may have been able to see these tools already if we brought them in last year. Um, so I use a lot. I use microscopes a lot, which I'm sure you all knew. I work with zebrafish, which is an animal model that we use for our research. I If any of you have zebrafish at home, you probably know how they look. Goldfishes are also kind of zebrafishes. So if like try to picture those, and those are the ones that I work with in my lab on a daily basis. We try to do a lot of stuff with them, but most of it is genetics work. So we try to look at in ways like I try to look at ways at how they compare to humans. So like what kind of things can I do to a zebrafish that will tell me about what would happen in a human body and things like that because they share a lot of our organs, and they actually share a lot of our DNA too. So this kind of stuff.
And somebody asked, what does a medical research scientist do? So, like, what else do you do besides maybe look at the zebrafish? What exactly? They want to know what do you do research on, or what does a medical research scientist do?
So that's a tough question because there's many different kinds of medical research. I only do a very specific tiny part of it, um, but if I can tell you in general, kind of like what a medical researcher is basically someone who's trying to answer a medical question as it relates to a specific disease or a specific condition, or trying to figure out why a specific problem happens and then try to answer it in a like in a biomedical setting. So most of us, I would say, work in the lab. Most of us, again, have an animal model that they work with. So in my case, it's zebrafish, but there are other medical scientists that work on mice, rats, pigs, primates, or things like monkeys and chimpanzees and things like that. So there are many different kinds of medical research, but they have kind of like the main fields I would say are neuroscience is one, molecular biology is one, immunology, pharmacology, things like that. So these are all different types of medical researchers, and all of them have different questions that they try to answer.
And another question somebody had was, how many years in college did it take to become a medical research scientist?
It usually takes about 8 years, if not more. So you have to do 4 years at least of college, and then undergrad, and then you have to do another 4 or 5 years of um, graduate school. So to have your PhD. So yeah, I'd say about 8 to 9 years in total.
And what kind of places hire somebody to be a scientist? So you might want to tell them where you work and then maybe some other places that they could become a scientist.
Definitely. So hospitals are known for to hiring us. So I work at, in addition to Northwestern University, I also work at Laurie Children's Hospital. It's kind of like both are part of the same organization, but like more my work is more specifically related to children. That's why I'm in Laurie Children's considered. But I also worked at Mayo Clinic before I moved here to Chicago. So colleges, universities, hospitals. Companies that try to design their different drugs or different medical equipment and things like that also hire scientists. A lot of job opportunities, you know if that's the field that you're thinking about choosing.
Thank you. So some of the younger kids who are watching this week, they're learning about observing and observations, and I know that's a big part of a scientist's job. So I thought maybe you could say something about, exactly like the scientific process, like the process you go through as a
Yep,
scientist.
definitely, that's a great question. So the observation is kind of at the core of what we do. It's really, I think, at the start of any experiment that we do in our daily life as a scientist. Like the way I kind of think about science is that when I look out of my window and I see something and I wonder about it, that's really how science starts. So like you see something outside or in your environment that kind of catches your attention, and then you start to wonder about it, and then maybe develop a question about why it's happening or how it's happening. And then once you come up with that question, the next part right away is to start observing how this process, whatever it is, takes place. So the scientific process always starts with the question, the observation, and then after you have the question and after you make some observations, then you start develop something called a hypothesis, where you're trying to answer the question that you came up with, but by doing an experiment to get to that answer, not by just making a guess or like trying to just think about what happens without doing any testing or experimenting. So the hypothesis is something that I can test. It's something that I could do an experiment on and try to figure it out. And then after the hypothesis, usually comes the actual procedure of the experiment. So that's when you actually start the testing process of your hypothesis. That's when you kind of gather materials. You go through the actual steps of the experiment. What you need to do, all the data that you need to collect, all these things that would help you maybe try to find the answer to the original question that you have. And then if you do collect some data and you get some results, then you can try to analyze these results, and then kind of develop a conclusion as to how your experiment went, and whether it helped you actually answer the question or it didn't, and more work needs to be done. So this is informally kind of how the scientific process works, but it always starts with observation. So honestly, the one piece of wisdom, if you call it, that I would leave you guys with is to always be curious. This is kind of one of the things that we really focus on as not just the scientists, but people who work, and I know in the educational field and any related field. Always follow your curiosity. Always be curious. Always ask questions about things that you don't understand. And if you happen to be in a setting where you can actually do an experiment on something or try to answer a question, be definitely pursue it and try to do so.
I'm good. My homeroom is watching, and we have a lot of animal lovers. Several of us have turtles. And so I was wondering, how do animals get used to do medical research?
That's a great question. So there are many different rules and regulations to this process. So it's not like we decide all of a sudden, hey, I want to do some tests on turtles or dogs or cats, and then just hey, I'll just grab a cat or a dog from somewhere and then I'll do it. That's not how it works. It's definitely highly unethical and should never be done. But in labs, what we do is we actually have to go through a process where you have to kind of apply to a certain entity that will allow you to use certain types of animals in your research. They have to know for sure and be absolutely positive that you're using that animal for the purposes of trying to answer your scientific question. You also obviously have to be a scientist, like an actual, certified, licensed scientist to be doing all of that work. They have to make sure that the animals are treated humanely and in the most, ethical and regulated process as they possibly can. And then if you get approved through all of these processes, if they think, okay, this is a valid question that all humanity needs answered, and you can help us get closer to answering a question about a disease or a specific problem that humans face, then they will allow you to use the animals. And then what kind of animal usually depends on what kind of question you're asking. So in my case, I study zebrafish because my questions revolve more around genetics and things like that. And zebrafish are a great model for that. But some other scientists have questions about behavior, or like things that are a little more advanced. So then they use higher animals, so like mice, rats, primates, so chimpanzees and monkeys and things like that. The closer the question gets to human behavior, the higher the animal would be, or like the bigger the animal would be, I would say.
We have another question from April in my homeroom. She's wondering if you have ever studied a real human brain.
I have actually. I've touched the human brain. I have kind of dissected the human brain. So I've held it in my hands, yes. But I haven't done like specific research on kind of like, because I have done actually also work on neurons. So like these are the cells that you'll find in the brain. But it's kind of difficult to distinguish between the two because they're not exactly what you would see right away if you look at a brain. They're kind of like inside of it. Um, so I guess yes, my answer is yes.
So if you're looking at the small parts of the brain that make it work, what kind of tools do you have to use to be able to see that?
Good question. So microscopes are definitely a very important tool that I think most scientists use. So in order to see all of these really, really tiny, parts of a brain, or like cells, or even like smaller than that, we really, really need to use microscopes. And we have different microscopes that have different strengths, so you can go like really, really, really small, and be able to see like some of like the very, very tiny parts of a human cell. Um, so microscopes are important. Computers are definitely important, because whatever you see on the microscope, you need to be able to take pictures of it, keep it, and then try to do some work on it and things like that. Um, so these are really, I think, the main tools that we would use for looking at things that are super small.
How do you how do you store a brain?
Oh, that's a good question. So we have this liquid that we put in. It's called formaldehyde. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it. It's a kind of a really smelly liquid that we put in, like the brains, or any, like a lot of the tissues or the human tissue that we use, just to kind of preserve it and keep it from decaying. Um, so yeah, we keep them like in sealed containers and things like that, so they don't really, like, nothing happens to them. Pretty much, we try to preserve them in the best way as possible. Hi, Jaime.
I have a question. Okay,
Sounds
Karim,
good.
how you doing?
Be happy to
Uh,
answer. I'm good. How are
so,
you?
so here's my question. What have you taken from studying the zebrafish, working with students, the young students, and people of my age?
Mhm.
Of course, you teach them and you observe them. What connections do you make when you study all these different groups?
That's a very good question. And I don't think you were here earlier when I was talking to Emily, and Jonathan. The main reason why we study zebrafish, is because they are similar to humans in a lot of ways. They're not as similar as chimpanzees, for example, when it comes to human behavior. So if we're looking just at how humans act, regardless of their age, like young, old, students, adults, things like that, chimpanzees and primates will be ideal for that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the only model. So there are things that I can study on a zebrafish, that humans do and adults do. So, like, for example, addiction is one of the things that we study on zebrafish very commonly. And they're actually a very good model for studying addiction, because you can train them to perform a specific task or do a specific behavior, and you can tie something to it that will cause an addictive behavior, and then you can look at how they respond to it. So, for example, we could easily make zebrafish addicted to things like nicotine or like things like that. That is definitely possible to do in zebrafish, and then we can try to analyze that behavior and look at it and see, is there a way to that we can try to treat them from that, or can we? Is there a way to try to stop them from making these things or like doing that behavior? We can also look at manifestations of mental illness in zebrafish. So we can do experiments and find out if they're anxious or not, or if they're depressed or not. So there are certain sets of behaviors that they do when they're in a different emotional state than normal, or the one you would expect. Like for example, we noticed that when zebrafish are anxious, they tend to swim. Like if they're adults, they tend to swim at the bottom of the tank, and maybe kind of towards the corners versus swimming close to the top, which is what their typical behavior is like. But where they swim in the tank could tell us how they're feeling. If they're young, if we put them in a small petri dish, they tend to swim on the outer layer of the petri dish rather than in the middle. And that could also tell us whether they're feeling anxious or stressed, or things like that. So there are many ways that we can look at these, like specific things in zebrafish that could tell us how a human would react in this situation, and especially stress and anxiety and things like
Thank you.
that. Yeah, of course. Great question.
I have another question for April. She's wondering, what is something that you have found out recently? Like, is there any big project you're working on right now and something you just discovered?
It's a tough question, because I happen to be one of those scientists that work on multiple different things at the same time. It doesn't always mean that I find huge discoveries every time I do an experiment, but there are many questions that I'm trying to answer at the same time, and some of them are related to zebrafish genetics, some of them are related to behavior, and then things like mental illness and addiction. Some of them are related to students and student interactions and knowledge and behaviors in the classroom. So I'm doing research in all of these different areas at the same time. If there's one, like if you want me to narrow down to one thing that I discovered recently, it's something that's more related to the zebrafish type of science. So, we're working on a zebrafish model that kind of looks at cholesterol formation or cholesterol synthesis in the body, as it relates to bone formation, and how like the bone structure of the zebrafish develops if they don't have these cells or these specific proteins that help them develop cholesterol. And one thing that we found is that sometimes when you're like if there's a specific disease that affects the fish's ability to make cholesterol, they end up with something that's very similar to a condition in humans called osteogenesis imperfecta, which kind of leads to very really weird formation of the bones. They tend to kind of fuse together rather than kind of like have some flexibility. So that's one of the things that I was looking at, and I was really looking at one protein that kind of contributes to this process, and if there are any like disruptions in the process of making that protein that could lead to some of these issues later on as the fish grows. So that's one of the things that I've been working. I know it doesn't sound as cool as I think it is, but but it was a pretty cool thing to see.
When I think of science, I think of all these little tiny pieces coming together. So even one tiny discovery helps us understand the bigger picture.
I definitely agree that is very true.
We're looking for anybody who's in the STEAM career field. So scientists, technology, the arts, engineers,
Mhm.
and people in the math field. So we're looking for all that, and we want to teach our children. We want to, expand their horizons and try to get them to think a little bit out of the box of what they could be when they grow up.
For sure.
And
No, I'll be happy to spread the word. I know for sure that a lot of my colleagues would be happy to do something like that, so I'll definitely spread the word.
Thank you.